On this episode of Eat Sleep Drive, it's a case of deja vu. I bought another 3 Series, and that means another oil filter housing gasket. Except this time it's on the turbo motor. I'm going to show you guys how to change the oil filter housing gasket on an N55 engine. What's going on, guys? Welcome to another episode of Eat Sleep Drive. And yes, it feels like I've just done this. I think it was last year when I had my 328 that I was doing this job. Well, guess what? I'm back again. I bought another 3 Series, which, go figure, I didn't learn my lesson last time. These things commonly have a problem with their oil filter housing gaskets. They leak, and mine is definitely leaking. Now, this is on an N55 car. It's pretty much the same procedure on an N54, so if you have an older 335i, this is basically going to be apples to apples. There's a few nuances, basically with taking the engine cover off, but other than that, it's pretty much the same. Basically, I wanted to show you guys how I'm going to be doing this today. The dealer wants a lot of money, close to $1,000 for this job, which is ridiculous. It's not too bad. It's definitely a little more complicated than on my N52, the NA engine that I had, but it's not too bad. So I'm gonna dive in today, show you guys basically what we need to do this job, and then we'll get into fixing the car. So as you guys can probably see, there's some oil just collecting right here, and you can't really see, but further down in the engine there's a little bit of oil pooling on the block, and I believe it's coming from this oil cooler. So there's actually 2 gaskets. There's one for this oil cooler here, and then there's one on this side for the oil filter housing that runs coolant and oil through that. So this is the biggest gasket, I'll say, and that goes on this side, connects the oil filter housing. This is a smaller gasket which goes on this side for the oil cooler. I'm not sure if it's just this one leaking or if they're both leaking, but I'm just going to replace both because I'm here, and they're both known to leak anyway, so I might as well put fresh gaskets in it. I also have here an oil filter that I picked up because I'm going to change the oil. There's a possibility of contamination between the oil and the coolant when these gaskets are bad. So in my opinion, it's just a good idea just to get fresh fluids in the engine and start with a fresh slate. So that's basically what you're gonna need. Oh, and an E10 and an E12 Torx, external Torx socket. You will need to get these special kind of fasteners off. Why BMW doesn't just use regular fasteners, I'm not sure. But you will need those, and I'll provide a link in the description of all the kind of basic stuff that you'll need. But let's dive in and start removing this air box first. Earlier I mentioned changing the oil. It's also a good idea to change the coolant when you do this job. I just chose not to because I'm going to be doing the water pump very shortly after this video. And I always like to, just as a safety precaution, plug up the intake tube with a towel of some sort, just in case, you know, you got these small things. If you drop a socket in there, that's really gonna suck. So I usually just put something in there to block off the intake tube just to make sure nothing foul happens. With the intake off, it's time to take off the engine cover because that's getting in our way. And this is just kind of like press fit on there. So you just kind of yank up, and I believe there's 4, one on each corner. And there you go, you just yank up and it comes right up. Now we can see a little more of what's going on. So let's explain kind of the general process here. So the first thing I'm going to do is take off 1, 2, 3, there's one under here, bolts to get this oil filter or this oil cooler off. That will be that one assembly. And then in order to get this oil filter housing off, there's a bolt down here that is basically unreachable unless you move the intake manifold. So we're going to have to shimmy the intake manifold a little bit. That involves removing roughly 7 fasteners and that sort of thing. So we'll remove the intake manifold, or not really remove it, but just kind of slide it out of the way so we can get to one of those fasteners. Then we'll take this off, replace the gaskets, and then kind of go in reverse. To take off this oil cooler, we have to first take off this T30 Torx bolt, and then that will allow us to remove these lines. So I'll just loosen this thing up. In order to get some wiggle room with these oil lines, I'm going to remove this 10mm bolt right here, which is just holding this bracket. And that's going to allow me to pull these down a little bit. And then once I get this bolt removed, I'll show you guys. I just have a little bottle here that I cut up. I'm going to put this under here just in an effort to, when I pull these oil lines down, to try and catch any oil that does inevitably spill and see how much we can catch. It's a pretty poor catch attempt, but we did catch some of the oil as it drains out. Now that we have our oil cooler lines out of the way here, we have to take off 3 fasteners on this oil cooler itself. I already took off one. Basically, these are E12 fasteners. If you don't have an E12 socket, if you have a 10mm 12-point socket, you can actually still take them off. At least I've taken off one. If you're just real gentle and you kind of apply pressure this way, as you loosen it, you can still get them off. So that's a nice little trick if you don't have an E12 socket. Okay, I've removed these 3 fasteners, 2 up here and there's 1 down here. But basically now I'm expecting some oil to come out here. So I'm gonna do my best to try and catch as much of the oil as I can, which could be interesting. But we're just gonna pry this off. Decided to get a screwdriver here to help me pry, which definitely works pretty choice. Let's see how much this oil we can grab here. That's not terrible. It's a good amount of oil, but it's not terrible. The next thing that we're going to do is remove this hose right here, and basically you just get a pick and there's a little clip right here that you pull off, and then now you can pull the hose off. Now there's going to be some coolant that comes out of here, so obviously I have this container under here, but try and catch as much as possible. I'm just going to squeeze the hose and try and get some coolant out preemptively. Because if I do that, there will be less coolant that ultimately comes out of this hose. This is another reason why I'm changing the oil, because as you can see here, there's definitely some room for cross-contamination as you have oil and coolant running through these passages. So that's about as much as I can get. So now comes the messy part. There we go, now it's coming off. All right, I'm gonna try and be in here as quickly as possible with this container, because there's gonna be a lot of coolant. There we go. That was fairly controlled. How about that? Now's as good a time as any to take this cap off for the oil filter. I don't have the special BMW tool, but I do have this wrench that does the job just fine. So let's take this off. We'll want to drain the oil from out of here, because otherwise it'll just make a big mess. Could take the oil filter out. Here's what I was talking about with the oil in here. We're gonna wanna drain this as best we can. Number one, just because it's a good idea to get all the old oil out, but number two, so it doesn't make a big mess when we pull this all off. Next, we have the very fun part of removing the intake manifold. Yes, unfortunately, you have to take off the intake manifold, or at least shimmy it over a little bit, in order to get to one of these bolts. So there are 7 11mm fasteners that are located along the intake manifold. I'm going to use a variety of extensions, and I might need to use a universal joint, basically just to kind of maneuver and get all these. But take out all 7. however you can. Some are easier to get at than others, but take those 7 out, and then we could get towards finally removing the major oil filter housing. Loosen the intake tube that goes to the throttle body if you need some extra room. I've taken off all 7 of the bolts that hold the intake manifold on. They're really not too bad. The one in the back, I would recommend a universal joint to get to because it's an odd angle. And then what I've done is just pulled it back. I've just yanked on this intake manifold back, and you could see it's come off the studs. I've yanked it back basically as far as it will go. It really won't allow me to anymore, and I've pushed it as far right as possible, and that's because you could see down in here, I've got the socket on that bolt just barely, right? Just barely on there. So now theoretically, I should be able to loosen that bolt. Fingers crossed. This is supposed to be the hardest one. We'll find out on that. There's another one that's not super easy either, but yeah, it's at least got a crack loose, and now we can just take this thing out, and there's 2 more to go. Okay, I'm doing these bolts in most difficult to least difficult order. I'm on to the second most difficult or medium difficult one. The problem I'm having with this is I can't get this socket on here without hitting this hose. So I'm gonna try a little hack here. This is not the right tool. This is an 8mm ratcheting wrench. And I tried it up here, and it fits on there. I was able to break that one loose. So I'm gonna attempt to use it on this guy because I don't have an E10 wrench, and I would like to get this done today. So let's see if we can pull it off. I'll try and push it on here as much as possible. Yep, that will work. So 8mm ratcheting wrench, and you can get this bolt out. How about that? Teaching you all the hacks. You don't have to buy all these specialty tools. Now it's just the last bolt here, and we can finally take this housing off. I've got some paper towels under there because I think it's going to be a little bit of a mess. Okay, we got that unplugged. There we go. I'm gonna get a rag here because it's probably gonna make a mess. So there's your oil filter housing. And you can see how messed up the gasket is down here. That doesn't look very good, which is probably why it was leaking. It's a good idea that we took off both these. So I'm gonna go ahead and clean this up with a little bit of brake clean and whatnot. And then we can put in the gaskets and then continue on putting this back together. Now has come the time to remove the old gasket. So I wanna basically do this in a way where ideally it all comes out in one piece. I don't want it to break up. So I just have a pick here. Thought we had it going. There we go. Okay, so now I just got a grab of it. And let's see if we could get this out in one piece here. Excellent, okay. So it all came out in one piece. We don't have to do too much cleanup here. We're just gonna clean up a little bit of this grime in here so we get a nice seal with our new gasket. But I'm gonna go ahead and remove this one, same way I did this one. And then, like I said, just clean this up a little bit. I have cleaned up all the mating surfaces, as you can see, loaded all the gaskets in. There's really nothing, rocket science about that. Just push the gaskets in, make sure this was all clean, and then push the gaskets in, make sure they're nice and flush. And now it's finally time to start reassembling this. So I'm just going to go ahead and go in reverse order of what we took apart and start to put all this junk back together. have everything pretty much back together, and before I do all the finishing touches, like put the engine cover on and then even the under tray, I want to make sure that there's no leaks and stuff. So I started the engine for a little while and have been checking around for coolant and oil and stuff. All looks good. So there is one more thing that we have to do, and I'm going to take you guys in the car to show you how. And this car has an automatic way of bleeding the coolant system. So I topped off the coolant reservoir with a little bit of coolant that we lost from this procedure, and then I'm going to show you guys how you let it go through the coolant bleeding process, and that will essentially be the last step other than putting everything back together. Like I said, I just want to make sure nothing's dripping and stuff like that. So let's go into the car and I'll show you how to bleed the coolant. The procedure for bleeding is pretty simple. Basically what you're gonna do is come in here, press this button once, the start button, but you're not gonna start the car because your foot's not on the gas. Then you're gonna make sure that the temperature gauges are all the way up to 84, fan is on low, and then all you have to do is hold down the gas pedal, 1 1000, 2 1000, 3 1000, 8 1000, 9 1000, 10 1000 for 10 seconds, and then you let go, and the water pump should come on and start cycling through its procedure. The water pump will make a bunch of weird noises for about 10 minutes, and then you're basically done. After your coolant is done bleeding, you are basically done. As you can see, I put my engine cover back on, and I'm also going to put the under tray back on because I don't see any leaks, everything looks good. Take a car for a drive, make sure everything is all good, get it up to temperature, make sure there's no leaks. But if everything is good and there's no leaks, then you just saved yourself a ton of money. You can basically buy these parts for less than $50 because they're just gaskets, right? This is kind of a big job, guys. It doesn't seem, it's not that difficult, but there's just like a lot of fiddly stuff, and I wouldn't say it's for the lighthearted. Certainly most people are capable of doing this, but if you've never worked on a car before, I would not attempt this. But basically, yeah, I'm super happy to have this hopefully not leaking after I take it for a drive and have new gaskets and everything. But I appreciate you guys watching. Let me know what you think in the comments below. This was definitely harder than my N52 that I did this procedure on. The N54, N55 turbo engines just make it a little more complicated. Didn't have to remove the intake manifold before, and I didn't have to deal with this oil cooler. But it's done, so I'm super happy about that. Appreciate you guys watching as always, and we will see you on the next episode of Eat, Sleep, Drive. So how many of you noticed the massive oil stain on my garage floor? Yes, this is a public service announcement. When you are using your oil drain pan, make sure that the plug is open. I left mine closed, proceeded to get about 3 quarts of oil all over my garage, and spent the next 3 hours cleaning it. What a dipshit.